A black female is driving her Mercedes-Benz smoothly and carefully through the city streets, suddenly sees flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police officer steps out, his gaze filled with prejudice, demanding her license and registration. But it doesn't stop there. His tone drips with condescension, his demeanor laced with quiet contempt. What he doesn't realize is that she's not just another driver. She's the chief of internal affairs. And he just made a serious mistake. The city of Atlanta, Georgia, bathed in twilight, exuded a serene beauty that was almost deceptive. The sky, painted in hues of deep orange, soft pink, and lingering lavender, stretched over the city like a masterpiece in motion, reflecting off the towering buildings and weaving through the streets below. The hum of traffic filled the air as people hurried home after a long day, their headlights flickering like fireflies in the urban sprawl. Among them was Dr. Maya Carter, her sleek black Mercedes-Benz gliding smoothly through the streets, a quiet symbol of her success and the battles she had fought to achieve it. Maya, a woman of unshakable confidence and quiet strength, sat behind the wheel with the poise of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, her black silk blouse crisp beneath the blazer, she exuded professionalism. Her natural curls were swept into a neat bun, and her diamond stud earrings caught the last flickers of daylight. Her mind was still processing the day's meetings, the weight of unfinished plans and ongoing investigations pressing against the edges of her consciousness. Being the chief of internal affairs at the Atlanta Police Department meant she was constantly unraveling cases of misconduct, sifting through complaints, and ensuring that the badge worn by officers in this city meant something real, something honorable. She was no stranger to the undercurrents of bias and corruption that still lingered in the force, the quiet whispers of resistance to change, the pushback from those who felt threatened by the very idea of accountability. And yet, she had never been one to back down. Tonight, as she made her way home, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace, the smooth notes of jazz from the radio blending seamlessly with the soft hum of the engine. The gentle sway of the streetlights above and the rhythmic tap of her fingers against the steering wheel created an almost hypnotic calm, a fleeting escape from the weight of her responsibilities. As she approached an intersection, the traffic light shifted from yellow to red just as she eased into the stop. Her foot pressed firmly against the brake, her movements unhurried, her mind already shifting to thoughts of the quiet dinner she had planned for herself, the book she had been meaning to finish. But just as the moment settled, the flicker of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror caught her attention. A faint glimmer at first, then an unmistakable intensity accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. Maya frowned slightly, her grip on the wheel tightening by an imperceptible fraction. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't run the light. So why was she being pulled over? The siren blared insistently, demanding her compliance. Taking a steady breath, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, her movements deliberate, composed. The weight of experience settled over her. She knew how these things could go. She had investigated enough cases to understand exactly how routine stops could spiral into something far more insidious. The door of the police cruiser creaked open, and from it emerged Officer Paul Henderson, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with the swagger of someone too accustomed to unchecked authority. He adjusted his belt and approached her vehicle with measured steps. His uniform was crisp, every button in place, his posture exuding the confidence of a man who expected compliance without question. His gaze, sharp and assessing, lingered on Maya as he approached, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. Maya lowered her window smoothly, her face composed, betraying none of the irritation stirring beneath the surface. She had encountered men like him before, officers who wielded their badges like weapons, who believed authority was synonymous with control. "License and registration," Henderson demanded, his voice firm, clipped. No greeting, no explanation. Just the assumption that she would comply without question. Maya studied him for a brief moment, her unease quiet but present. There was something about the way he was looking at her, calculating, as if searching for a reason to escalate this encounter. Still, she kept her tone measured, polite. "Is there a problem, officer?" Henderson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough to make a point, his gaze unwavering. "We'll talk about that after I see your license and registration," he said, his tone carrying a weight of something more than just protocol. Maya held his stare for a second longer than necessary. Then, without a word, reached for the glove compartment. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She knew better than to make any sudden gestures. Retrieving her documents, she handed them over with a steady hand, watching as Henderson took them, his fingers lingering over her license just a second too long. His eyes flicked back to her, his expression unreadable. "You ran a yellow light," he stated, finally offering a reason, though his voice lacked the neutrality it should have carried. Maya tilted her head slightly, her tone even. "I came to a full stop when the light turned red, officer. If there's been a misunderstanding, I'm happy to clarify." Henderson let out a quiet scoff, barely concealed. He took another step back, still holding her documents, but instead of reviewing them properly, he seemed more focused on studying her. Her suit. Her demeanor. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked suddenly, his brows lifting in a way that felt more like a challenge than a question. Maya didn't blink. "My address is on my license," she replied evenly. But Henderson wasn't interested in the answer. He smirked slightly, a fleeting expression devoid of any real amusement. "An address is one thing," he mused, his tone dry, laced with condescension. "But my instincts tell me something else. You in a hurry to get through that intersection?" The question carried an implication that made Maya more acutely aware of what this was. This wasn't a routine stop. This was something else. A test. A power play. A challenge wrapped in the thin veneer of protocol. She chose her words carefully. "I wasn't in a hurry," she said firmly. "I was driving home. As I said, I stopped when the light turned red." Henderson chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if amused by some private joke. "Home," he repeated. "Where's home?" Maya's patience thinned, but she kept her voice steady. "As I mentioned, officer, the information is on my license. If anything is unclear, you're welcome to check again." Henderson nodded, but he didn't glance back at her documents. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on hers, as if peeling back layers, searching for something unspoken. "Where do you work?" he asked, his voice shifting slightly, as though he were fishing for a specific response. Maya felt the shift in the air. This wasn't about traffic anymore. This was about identity. About making her justify her presence. About reminding her of the power he believed he held. She kept her tone controlled, but the steel in her voice sharpened. "I don't believe that question is relevant to why you pulled me over, officer." Henderson squinted slightly, his movements deliberate. "Sometimes I ask questions that aren't strictly about traffic violations," he said, his tone dripping with suggestion. "Just trying to get to know the person I'm speaking with. Especially when they don't seem like the people I usually see around here." There it was. The unspoken accusation. The justification behind this entire encounter. Maya exhaled slowly, her gaze unwavering. She had seen this before. She had fought against it. But this time she wasn't just an investigator reviewing a case file. This time she was living it. And Henderson had no idea who he was dealing with. Maya remained perfectly still, her eyes locked onto Henderson's with an unflinching steadiness that made the moments stretch uncomfortably between them. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the way he was measuring her, testing her. It wasn't about a traffic stop anymore, it never had been. This was about dominance, about his need to assert power over someone he believed shouldn't be sitting behind the wheel of a luxury car, dressed in a tailored suit, exuding confidence without apology. She had seen this play out in reports, in testimony after testimony from civilians who had filed complaints, their voices often ignored, their concerns dismissed as paranoia or exaggeration. But now, standing at the center of the very situation she had spent her career investigating, she felt the full force of it pressing against her. Henderson let the silence linger, as if waiting for her to break it first, but Maya refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, she studied him with the same scrutiny he was attempting to impose upon her, watching for the cracks beneath his facade. And there it was, the flicker of irritation, the brief shift in his posture, the subtle tightening of his grip on her license, as he realized she wasn't intimidated, that she wasn't playing into whatever script he had been expecting. He took a step closer, just enough to loom slightly, just enough to force his presence upon her. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of authority, but also something else. A challenge. Maya didn't move. Her fingers remained relaxed on the steering wheel, her expression unreadable. "Officer, I've fully complied with your requests. My paperwork is in order. and I haven't committed a traffic violation. Can you explain the reason you need me to exit the car?" Henderson smirked, a slow, deliberate pull at the corner of his mouth, but it wasn't amusement, it was condescension, barely veiled beneath the surface. "Are you arguing with a lawful police order?" His voice dropped just slightly, the threat embedded in the question clear. That's not the smartest way to handle this. There it was. The push, the thinly veiled attempt to provoke a reaction, to turn the situation in his favor. Maya inhaled slowly, controlled, keeping her tone measured. "I'm not arguing. I'm asking for clarification." Henderson exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if she were being deliberately difficult. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his voice sharper this time, more forceful. Maya knew refusing outright could escalate things, and she wasn't about to hand him the excuse he was looking for. Instead, she gave a slow, deliberate nod, unbuckling her seatbelt with unhurried precision. She moved with a quiet authority, refusing to let him dictate the pace, refusing to appear anything less than in control of herself. When she opened the door and stepped out, the evening air was thick with tension, the street eerily quiet, except for the occasional distant hum of passing cars. Henderson took a step back, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, as if searching for anything to justify the way he was handling this stop. "Place your hands on the hood," he instructed, his tone devoid of emotion, purely mechanical. Maya turned to face him fully now, her gaze unwavering. "What exactly are you suspecting, officer?" Henderson's jaw tightened. "It's standard procedure," he said, the smirk returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Better safe than sorry." Safe? For who? Maya knew this game. She had read it in countless reports, watched it unfold in body cam footage, listened to the frustration and fear in the voices of those who had been subjected to it. The way authority was wielded not to protect, but to intimidate. To remind people like her that, in the eyes of officers like Henderson, their presence was always suspicious. Still, she didn't resist. She wouldn't give him that. Turning slowly, she placed her hands on the cool surface of the car's hood, her posture straight, unyielding. She felt the shift in the air as Henderson moved in closer, the deliberate slowness of his search not born out of necessity, but of something else. His hands moved methodically, but they lingered longer than they needed to, the weight of his touch carrying an unspoken message. "You're taking longer than necessary, officer," Maya said, her voice level, controlled, though there was a steel edge to it now. Henderson didn't respond right away. Instead, he finished his search with an unnecessary pat to her shoulder before stepping back, his frustration evident in the way his expression flickered between irritation and something else, disappointment. As if he had been expecting this to go differently, as if he had been hoping for something that would justify his actions. "You're clean," he muttered, as if the words themselves were an inconvenience. Maya straightened, turning to face him, her hands smoothing over the sleeves of her blazer as if brushing away the remnants of whatever power play he had attempted. "I could have told you that," she said, her voice calm but cutting. Henderson clenched his jaw. "You seem awfully familiar with this process," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, the implication heavy in his words. "This isn't your first time, is it?" Maya tilted her head slightly, letting the silence stretch just enough to make him uneasy before she responded. "I understand how these situations work," she said simply. Henderson took another step forward, his voice dropping lower. "You know, people often think confidence will get them out of trouble," he mused. "But confidence can easily be misinterpreted as something else." "A threat." Maya met his gaze, unblinking. "And what exactly are you misinterpreting, officer?" For the first time, Henderson hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. He had spent the entire encounter attempting to assert control, to shift the balance of power, and yet, with each passing moment, he was losing his grip on it. "Tell me," he said, his tone shifting, "what do you do for a living?" Maya exhaled slowly, considering him for a moment before answering. "I work in a field where transparency and accountability are critical." Something in Henderson's expression flickered just for a moment. He could sense something was off now, that maybe, just maybe, he had miscalculated. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, stepping closer. "You seem to know a lot about what I'm authorized to do," he said. "You hiding something?" Maya let a small, almost imperceptible smile touch the corner of her lips. Not amusement, something colder, something that carried weight. Hiding, she repeated, as if tasting the word. No, officer. But I do find it interesting that you'd think so. Henderson's grip on his belt tightened, his stance shifting slightly. She could see the conflict warring in his expression now. Something wasn't adding up for him. He wanted this to be simple. He wanted her to react, to give him a reason. But instead, she was dissecting him, peeling back his intentions layer by layer. You think you're smarter than me, don't you? Henderson asked, his voice carrying a quiet edge of irritation now. Maya's gaze didn't waver. No, she said, but I do know this confidence is not a crime, and respect is not a privilege. It's something every citizen deserves, no matter what they look like. Henderson exhaled sharply, as if trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Maya took a slow step forward, her voice dropping just slightly. Now, officer, she said, her words deliberate, cutting. Are we done here? For the first time that evening, Henderson had no response. Henderson stood still, his grip tightening on his belt as though he was grounding himself, trying to reclaim the authority that had been slipping through his fingers with every passing second. His mouth opened, then shut, the words catching somewhere between his throat and the burning frustration simmering beneath his skin. He had expected a different outcome. A show of submission. A stammering excuse. The wide-eyed fear he had seen in so many others when faced with the weight of his authority. But instead, he had found something far more dangerous: unwavering confidence. Controlled defiance. A woman who not only knew her rights but wielded them like a shield he could not penetrate. Maya watched the battle play out in his expression, the flicker of hesitation, the internal calculation. He had two choices now: escalate or retreat. And retreating meant admitting, at least to himself, that he had never been in control of this interaction to begin with. The silence between them stretched taut, heavy with unspoken words, and for a moment Maya wondered if he would take the bait, if his ego would push him into the next mistake that would seal his fate. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply through his nose, like a man making a reluctant concession. You can go, he muttered, the words tasting like defeat on his tongue. Maya held his gaze a beat longer, searching for any sign of lingering hostility, any indication that he would try one last time to claw back the upper hand. But there was nothing left for him to grasp. She had taken it all, and he knew it. She nodded once, crisp and deliberate, before reaching for her license and registration, which he returned with a stiffness that made it clear he resented every second of this moment. Without another word, she turned, moving with a composed grace that only deepened the sting of his failure. She slid back into her car, closing the door with quiet finality, and fastened her seatbelt with a kind of measured precision that made it clear she had never been shaken. As she shifted the car into gear, she could still see him standing there in her peripheral vision, his hands braced on his hips, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might crack. His failure sat between them, unspoken but palpable. And as she pulled away, she didn't give him the satisfaction of looking back. But this wasn't over. Maya knew men like Henderson, knew the way their minds worked. He would simmer over this, stew in his humiliation, and sooner or later he would look for a way to reclaim the power he felt he had lost. Maybe not with her, but with someone else. And that was unacceptable. Her pulse remained steady as she drove, but her mind was already working, already calculating the next steps. By the time she pulled into the driveway of her modern, understated home on the outskirts of the city, her decision was made. She killed the engine, stepped out into the crisp night air, and let herself savor the quiet for only a moment before heading inside. She placed her keys on the counter, kicked off her heels, and walked straight to her home office, where a sleek black laptop awaited. Within minutes, she was logged into the internal database of the Atlanta Police Department, her fingers moving with precise efficiency as she entered Henderson's name into the records system. She didn't expect to be surprised by what she found, and she wasn't. Multiple complaints, excessive force, verbal intimidation, racially charged comments. None had resulted in disciplinary action beyond a slap on the wrist. Some had been dismissed outright. Maya exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. This wasn't just about Henderson. This was about the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for years, the culture that had protected him, enabled him, emboldened him. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin, her mind sharpening into focus. Tomorrow she would take this further. Tomorrow she would set the wheels in motion for something much bigger than just a disciplinary review. Because tonight had been a reminder, a personal, undeniable reminder that the work she did wasn't just about policies and reports. It was about making sure that men like Henderson didn't get to decide who was worthy of respect, who was allowed to move freely without fear, who was considered a citizen, and who was considered a suspect. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin, and she was more than ready for it. The next morning, the Atlanta skyline was bathed in the soft glow of early sunlight, the city stirring to life with its familiar rhythm of honking horns, distant sirens, and the hum of people moving toward another day. But for Maya Carter, this morning carried a different weight. She had woken with the same clarity she had fallen asleep with, the encounter with Officer Henderson still fresh in her mind, not as an isolated event but as a symptom of a much larger disease. The system had failed, time and time again, allowing men like him to thrive under the protection of bureaucratic indifference. That failure ended today. Dressed in a navy blue suit, her expression unreadable but her purpose unwavering, Maya strode through the glass doors of the Atlanta Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The office was sterile in its efficiency, rows of desks, a wall lined with case files, the hum of conversations conducted in hushed tones. She nodded at a few familiar faces, but didn't stop to exchange pleasantries. There was work to be done. As she entered her office, she closed the door and pulled up Henderson's record on her monitor once more. The list of complaints sat on the screen like an indictment of everything that had been ignored for too long. One by one, names and dates stared back at her, each one a story of someone who had been subjected to his unchecked authority. People who had been pulled over without cause. People who had been spoken to with barely concealed disdain. People who had been made to feel small, guilty of nothing but existing in a way that made him uncomfortable. Her jaw clenched. She reached for the phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. Chief Wallace, a gruff voice answered. "It's Maya," she said, her tone all business. "I need to see you. Now." There was a pause, the faint rustling of papers on the other end, then a sigh. "Come up." Maya didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she was standing in front of the polished oak door that led to Chief Ethan Wallace's office. She knocked once before pushing it open, stepping inside with the same confidence she carried everywhere. Wallace, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades navigating the politics of law enforcement, sat behind his massive desk. His blue uniform was pressed to perfection, his badge gleaming under the office lights. He was neither a friend nor an enemy to Maya. He was pragmatic, cautious, and above all, concerned with keeping the department running smoothly. She closed the door behind her and placed a thick folder onto his desk. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Wallace leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking from the folder to her face. "You sound like you're about to make my morning more complicated." "Read it," she said simply. With a resigned sigh, Wallace flipped open the folder, scanning the pages. As he read, his jaw tightened, his fingers drumming once against the desk before he turned another page. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, he closed the folder and exhaled. "Henderson." Maya nodded. "You know this isn't just about him. Look at the dates on those complaints. Look at how many times they were dismissed or marked unsubstantiated. This is a pattern, Chief. And it's not just one officer." Wallace ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly older. "What are you proposing?" "A full review," Maya said, her voice steady. "Not just on Henderson. On the entire system that allowed him to operate like this for years without consequence." Wallace let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You realize the pushback we're going to get if we open that door?" "I do," she said. "And I also realize what happens if we don't. We lose whatever shred of trust this department still has with the public. We can't afford that, Chief. Not anymore." He studied her for a long moment, weighing his options, measuring the risk. Then, finally, he leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You really think you can pull this off?" Maya's gaze didn't waver. "I don't think, Chief. I know." Another beat of silence. Then, with a reluctant nod, Wallace reached for his phone. "I'll call the deputy chief. Let's get this started. Maya exhaled, but there was no relief, only the certainty that this was the first step in what would be a long, brutal fight. And she was ready for it. The fallout came faster than Maya had anticipated. By noon, the Internal Affairs Division was buzzing with tension, the kind that settled thick in the air like a brewing storm. Word had already begun to spread, not just about the investigation into Henderson, but about the broader departmental review that Maya had set into motion. She could feel the shift the moment she stepped out of her office. Sideways glances from officers passing by, murmured conversations that hushed the second she came within earshot. Some of them were just curious, waiting to see where this would go, but others were already choosing sides. She wasn't surprised. She had expected resistance. No institution, especially one as entrenched as law enforcement, took kindly to self-examination. The blue wall had held strong for decades, shielding misconduct behind layers of bureaucracy and unspoken codes of loyalty. Cracking it open now, forcing officers to confront the failures within their own ranks, would not go unchallenged. Maya had spent the morning combing through additional reports, searching for patterns, connections, anything that could reinforce what she already knew to be true. Henderson wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom of a larger issue, one that had gone ignored for too long. Her team had already begun compiling a list of cases where complaints had been dismissed without proper investigation. Incidents swept under the rug, victims gaslighted into believing they had imagined the hostility, the profiling, the unnecessary escalation. And now, the first wave of pushback was coming. The knock at her office door was sharp and patient. Maya didn't bother looking up from her screen. "It's open." The door swung inward, and in stepped Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, his presence filling the space with an energy that was both controlled and simmering beneath the surface. A veteran of the department, Reynolds had been on the force for over 20 years, long enough to have seen plenty of officers come and go, long enough to believe he had earned the right to dictate how things were run. Maya didn't react as he shut the door behind him, the click of the latch a quiet punctuation to the tension in the air. She finished typing her last note before finally meeting his gaze. His stance was rigid, his expression carefully neutral, but she could see the fire in his eyes, the barely contained frustration. "Something on your mind, Lieutenant?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Reynolds exhaled slowly, arms crossing over his chest. "I heard about the review." Maya leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. "I imagine you did." He let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "You sure know how to shake things up, Carter." "I didn't come here to shake things up," she said evenly. "I came here to fix things." Reynolds scoffed. "Fix things?" "Right. And you think tearing this department apart from the inside is the way to do that?" Maya's gaze didn't waver. Holding officers accountable isn't tearing anything apart. It's strengthening it. Reynolds shook his head, stepping closer. "Look, I get it. You're trying to clean house. But you need to understand something. There's a way things are done here. A system. You start pulling at threads, and you're going to unravel more than you're ready for." Maya tilted her head slightly. "Are you warning me, Lieutenant?" Reynolds held her stare for a long moment before shaking his head. "I'm giving you advice. There's a difference." Maya let a beat of silence stretch between them before she spoke again. "You've been in this department a long time, Reynolds. You've seen how things work. So tell me, how many times have you seen complaints like Henderson's come across a desk only to disappear? How many times have you watched good officers look the other way, because calling out a bad one would cost them more than staying silent?" Reynolds clenched his jaw, shifting his weight slightly. "You think you're the first person to try and change things?" "No," Maya said. "But I intend to be the first one to succeed." The words landed hard between them. For a moment, Reynolds just stared at her, as if trying to decipher whether she was truly that confident or simply reckless. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he took a step back. "You're making enemies, Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "And you might think you're ready for that, but trust me, you're not." Maya didn't blink. "I don't need to be ready, Lieutenant. I just need to be right." Reynolds studied her for a long moment, then let out a breath and turned toward the door. He hesitated for half a second before speaking over his shoulder. "Be careful what you dig up." Then he was gone, the door shutting with a quiet finality behind him. Maya exhaled slowly, staring at the empty space where he had stood. She knew what Reynolds was really saying. There were lines in this department that weren't meant to be crossed. People with too much invested in the status quo to let her burn it down without a fight. But she hadn't come here to play it safe. She turned back to her screen, fingers poised over the keyboard, and with renewed determination she continued. The warning lingered in the air long after Reynolds had left, but Maya didn't let it slow her down. If anything, it only solidified her resolve. She had expected resistance hell, she had counted on it. But she wasn't here to negotiate with a broken system. She was here to fix it, no matter how many people resented her for it. She spent the rest of the afternoon combing through reports, searching for the threads that connected officers like Henderson to the larger problem at hand. Patterns emerged, complaints dismissed with vague explanations, incidents buried under technicalities, investigations that had been quietly closed before they even began. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to put the pieces together. By the time the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting the city in a deep amber glow, Maya knew she had enough. Enough to justify pushing this forward. Enough to demand real action. She just needed the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than expected. At precisely 6:17 p.m., her phone buzzed against the polished surface of her desk. She glanced at the screen. Chief Wallace. She answered immediately. Chief. You might want to come upstairs, Wallace said, his voice unusually tense. Now. Maya didn't waste time. Within minutes, she was stepping into the chief's office, where Wallace sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. But she wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was Deputy Chief Alan Whitaker, a man whose reputation preceded him. A career officer with deep political connections, Whitaker was known for being calculated, pragmatic, dangerous in his own way. Maya shut the door behind her, her eyes flicking between the two men. What's going on? Wallace exhaled, nodding toward Whitaker. The deputy chief wanted to discuss your investigation. Maya shifted her gaze to Whitaker, her expression carefully neutral. I wasn't aware I needed to discuss it. Whitaker smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Come on, Carter. We're all on the same team here. Maya said nothing. She had seen that smile before on men who thought they could charm their way through a situation they didn't fully control. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. Look, I understand what you're trying to do. Really, I do. We all want accountability. We all want to make sure the department is running the way it should. He paused, studying her. But there's a right way and a wrong way to go about this. Maya's jaw tightened slightly. And you're here to tell me I'm doing it the wrong way? Whitaker chuckled, shaking his head. I'm here to tell you that you're walking a very fine line. He leaned forward, his voice lowering just slightly. You're making a lot of noise, Carter, and noise has consequences. Maya held his gaze, unblinking. The only people who fear consequences are the ones who have something to hide. Whitaker's smile flickered. Be careful, Carter. You're playing with fire. Maya tilted her head slightly. Then maybe it's time some things burned. The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Whitaker studied her for a long moment before finally exhaling, shaking his head as if disappointed. You're not going to back down, are you? Maya's expression remained unchanged. Not now, not ever. Whitaker tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair, then pushed himself to his feet. Then I hope you're ready for what comes next. With that, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving only the faint scent of expensive cologne and the weight of an unspoken threat behind him. Maya turned back to Wallace, who let out a long sigh, rubbing his temple. You really don't know when to quit, do you? No, Maya said simply, and that's exactly why you called me here in the first place. Wallace chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. He leaned forward, his expression more serious now. They're going to push back, Carter. Hard. You know that, right? I do. Wallace studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Then let's make sure we do this right. Maya exhaled, feeling the weight of what was ahead. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back now. And she wouldn't have it any other way. The storm came exactly as Maya had expected. Within days, whispers turned into full-fledged murmurs, and murmurs erupted into outright resistance. The tension inside the department was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Officers who had once exchanged casual greetings with her now averted their eyes when she passed. Others weren't so subtle. There were meetings she was suddenly no longer invited to, conversations that stopped abruptly the moment she walked into the room, and paperwork that had mysteriously begun moving slower than usual. It was the classic playbook: isolation, obstruction, intimidation. But Maya Carter had never been easily intimidated. She continued her work with unwavering determination, ignoring the glances, the unspoken warnings, the manufactured inconveniences meant to slow her down. Every night she pored over files, making connections, drawing patterns, and building an ironclad case. Henderson's name was just the beginning. His behavior, his unchecked authority, and the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchallenged for years were the first domino, and she had lined up enough of them to send a ripple through the entire department. She knew what was coming next. The moment they realized she wasn't backing down, that she had the full weight of internal affairs behind her, they would shift from quiet resistance to open warfare. And it didn't take long. The attack came on a Wednesday afternoon. Maya was in her office when her email notification pinged. She clicked it open, her stomach tightening as she scanned the contents. It was an anonymous message sent from an internal account. "Watch your back, Carter. People who dig too deep don't always like what they find." A threat. Predictable. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This wasn't the first time she had been warned to step away from something uncomfortable. The difference was, this time she was the one holding all the cards. She closed the email, locking it away in her mental file of things to deal with later, and pushed forward. Later that evening, as she drove home, her mind churned over every move she had made so far, every piece of the puzzle she had uncovered. Henderson had been the starting point, but now the trail had led to more names, more cases, more officers whose records were stained with allegations that had never been properly investigated. A system that had protected its own at the expense of those it was meant to serve. But the moment she turned onto her street, something in her peripheral vision made her grip the steering wheel tighter. A car, dark, nondescript, parked a few houses down from her own. It wasn't a neighbor's. It didn't belong there. She slowed just slightly, enough to glance at the rearview mirror. The windows were tinted, but she could see the silhouette of someone inside, unmoving, watching. Her jaw tightened. She didn't pull into her driveway right away. Instead, she drove past her house, making a slow, deliberate loop around the block. When she came back, the car was gone. She sat in her vehicle for a moment, heart steady but mind racing. It was a warning. A reminder that she was being watched. She took a slow breath, then stepped out of her car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked up to her front door. She refused to look over her shoulder. Whoever they were, whatever message they were trying to send, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they had gotten to her. Inside, she locked the door behind her, her mind already moving ahead. If they thought she would be intimidated into backing down, they didn't know her at all. The next morning she walked into the Atlanta Police Department with the same unshakable confidence she always carried. She had barely set foot in her office before she was summoned to Wallace's. He was waiting for her when she arrived, arms crossed, expression grim. A folder sat in front of him, and before she could say a word, he slid it toward her. Maya opened it, scanning the document inside. A formal complaint, against her. She exhaled sharply through her nose. That was fast. Wallace leaned forward. "They're coming for you, Carter. You knew that." She shut the folder with a quiet snap. "What's the charge?" "They're calling it professional misconduct. Claiming you're targeting officers unfairly. Harassment, overreach, you name it." Maya smirked. "They really reached for that one." Wallace sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I back what you're doing, but this is politics now. They're trying to discredit you before you take this any further." Maya folded her arms. "So what happens now?" "You fight it." Wallace met her gaze. "And you make damn sure you win." Maya nodded slowly, then turned and walked out of his office. She knew what she had to do. That night, she called a press conference. The next day, Under the harsh glare of flashing cameras and microphones, she stood at the podium, the city of Atlanta watching. She spoke calmly, deliberately. She laid it all out. The misconduct, the cover-ups, the officers who had abused their power with impunity, the victims who had been ignored, dismissed, forgotten. She named names. She called for action. She made it clear that she wasn't just investigating Henderson. She was dismantling the system that had created him. By the time she finished speaking, the fire had been lit. And there was no putting it out. Henderson was suspended within 48 hours. The formal complaint against Maya was dismissed. The department announced sweeping internal reforms. And though she knew the fight wasn't over, though she knew the resistance would only grow stronger, she also knew this. She had won this round. The press conference had been a battle won, but the war wasn't over. The weight of her words had sent shockwaves through the department, forcing a reckoning that could no longer be ignored. Officers who had once felt untouchable were now under scrutiny, their past actions no longer buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Some stood firm, unwilling to change, clinging to the old ways with white-knuckled desperation. Others, those who had grown tired of looking the other way, began to step forward. Quiet at first, then louder. The tide was shifting. But change didn't happen overnight. In the months that followed, investigations were reopened. Complaints that had been dismissed were given the attention they had always deserved. Training programs were overhauled, focusing not just on tactical procedures but on ethics, accountability, and bias recognition. A new oversight committee was formed, composed of both law enforcement and community leaders, ensuring that officers no longer policed in the dark, unchecked and unchallenged. Some officers left. The ones who couldn't stomach accountability, who saw transparency as an attack rather than a necessity, handed in their badges. Others, the ones who had waited for this moment, who had always wanted to serve with integrity but had been stifled by a system that rewarded silence, stepped up. And Henderson? He was done. Done. Not just suspended. Fired. His past actions had finally caught up to him, the weight of his misconduct too heavy to ignore under the new leadership that had begun to emerge. He left the force in disgrace, stripped of the authority he had once wielded like a weapon. Maya didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. This had never been about one man. This had been about the system that created him. And that system was finally breaking. She watched the changes unfold from the inside, staying relentless, refusing to let the momentum die. Every new policy, every hard-fought reform, every shift in culture, she ensured that it wasn't just for show. This wasn't just about optics. It was about substance. It was about building something that would last long after she was gone. 1 year later, standing at the same podium where she had first exposed the department's failures, she addressed the city once more. But this time she wasn't exposing corruption. She was proving that change was possible. That the Atlanta Police Department was no longer the same place it had been a year ago. That the shield, the badge, the oath meant something again. And as she stepped down from the stage, walking through a crowd that no longer looked at her with suspicion, but with respect, she knew. She had won. For real. This time. And this time, there was no going back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.